My name is Tiago and I saw God. I truly met who God is, and can I tell you something? All religions have lied to you, but before I tell you, subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Continuing. Sweat dripped down my face as I climbed. Yet another steep slope of the Serra do Mar. As a guide for the rescue team, I was used to extreme situations, but that night was different. The storm forming on the horizon wasn't part of the plan, and the group of lost students needed to be found before the storm hit. "Tiago, I think we should turn back," Marcella shouted over the radio, her voice nearly swallowed by the wind that had begun to howl through the trees. I ignored my teammates' advice. Something told me we were close. It had already been 12 hours since we received the call. 3 young students had gotten lost during a research hike in the forest. Cell service was non-existent in that area, and the only information we had was that they intended to study a rare species of orchid that only bloomed at night. 15 more minutes, I replied, adjusting the headlamp on my forehead. If we don't find anything, we'll head back to base camp. That's when I heard the sound of rocks tumbling. I turned too quickly and the soaked ground gave way beneath my feet. I tried to grab onto something, anything, but my hands only found the damp night air. The fall was like a nightmare in slow motion. The impact knocked the air out of my lungs. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, and a metallic taste filled my mouth. Above me, I heard Marcella's desperate screams. "Tiago! Tiago, answer me!" I tried to shout back, but no sound came out. The raindrops began to fall cold against my face. The pain gradually subsided, replaced by a strange sense of peace. It was as if my body was becoming lighter, floating. Suddenly I realized I could see everything from above. My body lying among the rocks, Marcella dangerously descending the slope to reach me, the lights of the other team members' flashlights converging on the spot. But I was no longer there. I was rising higher and higher, leaving the darkness of the forest behind. A tunnel of light opened before me, so bright it should have blinded me, but it didn't. It was comforting, like a long-awaited embrace. The peace emanating from it was something I had never felt before. It was like coming home after a long journey. I was drawn into that light, and there, something extraordinary happened. A presence manifested, a figure I instantly recognized, even though I had never seen it before. It was Jesus, not the Jesus from the church pictures my grandmother kept, but something much more real, more alive. How can I explain to you what I felt in that moment? I, who grew up in a family that barely set foot in a church, who always doubted anything that couldn't be explained by science, was standing before something that defied all my logic. If you've ever had a moment like that in your life, a moment that changed everything you believed, you know what I'm talking about. There were no words, none were needed. It was as if all the knowledge of the universe was being poured directly into my consciousness. I understood with crystal clarity that everything we thought we knew about life, death, and the divine was just the tip of an immense iceberg. "Tiago, hang in there, the helicopter is coming." Marcella's voice pulled me back, like a hook reeling in a fish from the depths. The light began to dissipate and I felt the weight of my body again. The pain returned, along with the rain and the cold of the night. I opened my eyes to find Marcella's worried face above me, her tears mixing with the raindrops. In the distance, the sound of helicopter blades cut through the air. "What happened?" she asked, noticing something different in my gaze. How could I explain, how could I tell her that in just a few minutes, my entire worldview had been transformed? Would you believe me if I told you? "The students," I murmured, suddenly remembering our mission. "They've been found," Marcella replied, holding my hand. "They're all safe, but you almost left us." As the medical team prepared me for rescue, a certainty formed in my mind. I had survived. For a reason. That experience couldn't have been just for me, but how could I share something so profound without being considered crazy? How could I explain the inexplicable? And you, have you ever had an experience that completely changed the way you see the world? Share it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter of this incredible story that's far from over. The Santa Casa Hospital in Santos had a particular smell, a mix of disinfectant and stale coffee that reminded me of my grandmother's house. After 3 days in the hospital, I already knew every crack in the ceiling of room 304, every shift change of the nurses, every sound from the hallway. My family took turns keeping me company. My mother, Donna Celia, spent entire afternoons there, knitting and pretending not to be worried. Every now and then, she would stop knitting to look at me with those eyes only a mother has, as if to make sure I was still breathing. "The doctor said it was a miracle," she commented for the 10th time that afternoon. "You fell more than 20 meters, Tiago, by all the laws of physics." "I know, Mom," I replied, trying to find a comfortable position in the bed. 3 broken ribs made any movement feel like torture. "But there's something I need to tell you." She dropped the knitting in her lap, and I noticed her hands trembling slightly. During those days, I had rehearsed this conversation mentally dozens of times. How could I explain to a woman who believed only in what she could see and touch that her son had encountered Jesus during a near-death experience? "When I was there, lying in the forest," I began, choosing each word carefully, "something happened that changed everything I ever believed." I told her everything, about the feeling of floating, the tunnel of light, the inexplicable encounter. As I spoke, I watched the expressions on her face change: concern, confusion, fear. When I finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. "Son," she finally spoke, her voice trembling, "you hit your head really hard. The doctor said it's normal to have hallucinations after a trauma like that." Before I could respond, the door to the room opened. It was Rosa, the night shift nurse, a black woman with kind eyes and a smile that seemed to light up the room. "Time for your medication, Tiago," she announced, pushing the medication cart. My mother took the opportunity to get up, murmuring something about getting coffee. Rosa began preparing the medications with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it for decades. But there was something different about her demeanor that night. "You know, Tiago," she said quietly as she checked the IV, "I overheard part of your conversation with your mom, and I wanted to tell you something." She looked around, as if checking if we were truly alone, and continued. 15 years. Tiago, I had a heart attack. I was dead for 4 minutes, and during that time I saw him too. My heart raced. She was the first person who didn't look at me like I was crazy. "The light was different from anything in this world, wasn't it?" she asked, her eyes glistening, with held-back tears. "Like a hug made of light," I replied, feeling a lump in my throat. "Exactly," Rosa smiled, squeezing my hand. "But you know what I learned? Not everyone is ready to hear this truth. Some need to discover it in their own time." That night, after everyone had left, I thought about Rosa's words. Through the hospital window, I could see the city lights reflected in the water of the port. How many people down there carried similar experiences? How many kept silent truths that had transformed their lives? I grabbed my phone and started researching near-death experiences. To my surprise, I found hundreds of accounts from people of different religions and cultures describing strikingly similar sensations. I wasn't alone. A movement in the hallway caught my attention. Through the crack in the door, I saw a different light, more intense than the hospital's fluorescent lights. My heart raced. Was it possible? If you've ever felt that inexplicable certainty that something extraordinary is about to happen, you know exactly how I felt in that moment. The door began to open slowly, and want to know what happened next? Don't miss the next chapter. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to be notified when the continuation arrives. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had an inexplicable experience? Have you ever felt something that science can't explain? How did you deal with it? The door opened completely, revealing Marcella. My rescue partner had disheveled hair and a distressed expression on her face. Even outside visiting hours, she had managed to convince someone to let her in. "You won't believe what happened," she said, closing the door behind her. Her hands were trembling as she pulled a chair close to my bed. "Remember the students we were looking for that night?" she continued, not waiting for my response. "I just interviewed them for the final incident report. Tiago, they saw something in that forest. Something they were afraid to talk about." A shiver ran down my spine. Marcella pulled a small recorder from her pocket and pressed play. The trembling voice of a young woman filled the room. "We had been lost for hours when we saw a light between the trees. We thought it was the rescue team, but it was different. It was as if the light itself was alive, and there was someone there, a figure. We couldn't see clearly, but we felt such peace. It was that light that guided us to a safe place where the rescue team found us later. Marcella stopped the recording and stared at me. All three told the same story, independently. And you know what's the strangest part? The time they saw that light was exactly when you fell. My hands began to sweat. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. There's one more thing you need to know, I said, gathering courage. And I told her about my experience, about the tunnel of light, about the encounter that changed my life. To my surprise, Marcella didn't show skepticism. Instead, her eyes filled with tears. My grandmother, she began, her voice choked. Before she died, she told me something similar. She had an experience during surgery. At the time, I thought it was the medication talking, but now, that's when Rosa, the nurse, entered the room. Her shift was starting, but there was something different about her expression. Sorry to interrupt, she said, but I heard you talking, and I think it's time to show you something. Rosa closed the door and pulled a worn notebook from her pocket. For 15 years, I've been collecting stories from patients who've had experiences like yours, Tiago. People from different religions, cultures, social classes, all describing the same encounter, the same light, the same unconditional love. She opened the notebook and began reading some accounts. It was astonishing how the stories connected, like pieces of a cosmic puzzle finally making sense. It's no coincidence you're all here today, Rosa continued. Everyone who goes through this has a mission. Yours, Tiago, began in that forest. Those students needed to be guided not just out of the woods, but to a greater truth. Suddenly I understood everything. It wasn't about converting people or proving something. It was about building bridges, connecting stories, showing that there are truths that transcend our differences. And now, Marcella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Now, I replied, feeling a deep certainty, we keep living but with our eyes and hearts more open, and most importantly, helping others understand that they're not alone in their extraordinary experiences. Rosa smiled, putting away her precious notebook. Sometimes a hospital isn't just a place to heal the body, she said. It's a meeting point for souls who need to share their truths. That night, as the port of Santos glowed outside and the stories echoed in my mind, I realized that my fall in the Serra do Mar hadn't been an accident. It was a calling, an awakening. And this was only the beginning. And you who have followed this journey so far, have you ever felt that there are greater truths than we can explain? What extraordinary stories do you carry? Share them in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. There's much more to come. Because in the end, perhaps the greatest revelation is this. We all carry a light within us. Sometimes we just need the courage to let it shine.